Many people have really fierce opinions about the death penalty, but very few know very much of anything about the actual nuts and bolts of how the whole system works. For 20 years, most all of my work has been defending many people from getting a death sentence, and if they already have a death sentence, from being executed. So I've personally got some pretty strong opinions. But I'm going to try to not preach about how horrible of a policy capital punishment is, but instead just focus on explaining the philosophy behind using it and how it actually works in practice. The U.S. is one of the very few countries in the world that actually still executes people. Most countries we think of as civilized don't execute people because it's simply considered way too barbaric. The U.S., along with North Korea, Iran, China, and Yemen, carry out the vast majority of executions every year. So the American justice system had to create a judicial philosophy in order to make it look like we weren't just nutso barbarians. For about the last 50 years, what's called the modern death penalty era, the way America has justified killing people who kill people is the following. First, only people convicted of committing first-degree murder are even potentially eligible to be executed. And within that small group of convicted first-degree murderers, only an even far smaller group can even be eligible for a jury to initially consider imposing the death penalty. The people that are in that small eligible group got there only because the jury first decided this murder was extra special. That something special is called an aggravating circumstance or a special finding, depending on the state or system using the death penalty. Then, even if the jury finds that the murder was special, they next must consider the guilty murderer's mitigating circumstances. Things like mental illness or being abused as a child. Things that don't excuse or justify the crime, but that help explain how the murderer ever could have gotten to this place in life in the first place, and that give the jury encouragement to exercise their mercy. So far, it all sounds kind of systematic and maybe even fair, at least on paper. But here's where and why it all breaks down and falls apart. Human beings. Human beings with all their faults and fears and classism and racism, they discriminate at every single decision point along the process. And their discrimination cannot be rooted out and stopped anywhere in the process. The elected prosecutor decides all by himself or herself whether to even seek the death penalty or not. It's completely up to them. So, if the murder happened in Fresno, they'll seek the death penalty. If it happened in San Francisco, they won't even try. Next, the supposed aggravating circumstances that make the murder especially bad and limit the number of people who can be eligible for the death penalty. Those aggravating circumstances have been expanded by state legislatures to literally cover every murder. Here are some of the aggravating circumstances that all jurisdictions have. The murder was especially cruel. It was especially heinous. It was committed in cold blood. The murder was motivated by money. The murder was senseless. The victim was old. The victim was young. You get the idea. So even though we call them special, they're not. Every murder is going to be seen as awful. Every murder, by definition, is unfair to the victim and to the victim's survivors. Every murder seems gruesome. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be called a homicide. So there's no limitation at all. And the people on the jury, most of whom have never seen photos of any murder scene, don't have any context to say, this one is not horrible compared to this other one. So they say all of them are horrible and aggravating, especially if the guilty murderer they just convicted also just so happens to belong to a race or a class that the jury members fear in the first place. It is then very difficult to convince the jury that just convicted the guy of first-degree murder and also found that the killing was especially bad to then decide that the murderer somehow deserves their mercy. Mercy translating into a life sentence in prison. So the system is rigged to create death sentences. Every single instance of murder has the components to justify a jury imposing the death penalty. The system depends on cops, on prosecutors, on judges, and on jurors to suddenly and voluntarily no longer discriminate against a guilty murderer who is almost certainly very poor, grossly undereducated, and frankly, a scary guy. Our system may look fair on paper, but that overlooks the fact that people have fears and prejudices and no context to make these kind of decisions fairly. Once a jury convicts and sentences a person to death, the appellate courts are then supposed to step in and provide meaningful review. But those courts typically only fix legal errors, and that rarely reverses a death sentence. Appeals courts assume that everyone acted fairly, that no one discriminated, unless the cops, prosecutors, or jurors step up, sign affidavits, swear under oath that they failed to put aside all of their lifelong discriminatory tendencies. Then the appellate courts keep assuming the system worked like it was designed to. So those courts approve the death sentences and wipe their hands of any responsibility, saying justice was served. In this series, I have hoped to first and foremost provide you with some grounded and easy tips to help navigate our criminal justice system. The second larger goal was to reveal the flaws within that system. Our criminal justice system is a massive, lumbering construct built upon hundreds of years of human thinking. Its ultimate goal is justice, but it frequently falls short. It is on all of us to be aware of and be vocal about these shortfalls. Use your rights to keep yourself and others safe, and please use your voice and your vote to help enact positive change. Thank you.